Shema Tov. The section in Sefer Melachim we're doing is probably the most unstudied and difficult to understand in all of Melachim. If you ask the standard person, like who's gone through Jewish education, they know Sefer Melachim exists. They've heard of Shlomo. I'm talking about the advanced students. They've heard of Shlomo. They've heard of the split of the kingdom, Yerovam, Rechavam. They've heard of Eliyahu Navi. They've heard of Ahab. They've heard of Yechizkiyahu. They've heard of Yeshayahu. They've heard of Yoshiyahu. But there's one section of Sefer Melachim which is like a black hole. And that's the whole time period of Yehu. And it's probably a good reason because when you read, did you read the stories yet? It sounds more like the news in Syria or in Iraq than it does than Jewish history. There's a lot of, it's a bloodbath. There's a lot of killing going on. There's a lot of destroying idols. It's like a religious purge, all in the name of God. And the question is, what do we learn from it all? So what I want to do in this year is two things. I want you to understand why this is going on in Sefer Melachim. And then I want to give an overall picture of what's happening in Sefer Melachim, what the book is about. And then we'll focus in and try to understand the story. Now, who wrote Sefer Melachim? Yirmiyahu. The question is going to be, as usual, why was the book written? We did the same thing a couple months ago with Sefer Yoshua, if those remember. It's easy to identify the purpose of Yoshua. Yoshua has a message to give over, that God kept his promise. Sefer Shoftim is rather easy to figure out. We have to understand that God does want a king, even though there's reasons why we shouldn't have a king. We explain why Shmuel writes a book to explain why he thought it was a bad idea, and why God says it's a good idea, even though they're asking for the wrong reason. Shmuel has to explain pretty much why David is chosen, or that David is chosen, despite all the question marks that come up. Even though he wasn't officially anointed, he isn't. There's a lot of logical reasons why we need the first three books of Nevi'im Rishonim. When it comes to Melachim, it almost looks like a history book, which is fine. But my whole point is, the books are not written to teach us history. There's got to be a prophetic message more than just, oh, here's what happened. For sure, I can learn history from the books, but what's going on? In my opinion, one of the key underlying themes of Yirmiyahu, and the reason why he's writing the book, is he has to explain why the first temple was destroyed. But not only that, he's sort of putting the blame on the split kingdom. I'll explain why. Every king in Sefer Melachim gets a report card, doesn't he? And it's pretty much a pass-fail system. And it doesn't seem very fair sometimes. Sometimes you have like really good kings who fail and really bad kings who get good. Give you an example. Yehu, what grade does he get? Good or bad? What? Better than a couple, but he's still Vayasara b'nei Hashem. Right? There's one king up north that gets a good, no matter how good they are. And there's a lot of things that Shlomo, in the end of his life, does idol worship, but he's Yasara b'nei Hashem. There's a lot of kings who, like Yoash in Melachim is good, in Divrei Yamim we find some bad things about what he does later in his life. What I want to suggest is as follows, is that one of the main considerations in the report card is what the kings are doing as far as Yerushalayim is concerned. In other words, the chet par excellence of Sefer Melachim of the northern kings is Chet Yerovam ben Nevat. Even though Ahab was much worse, there's a lot of kings way worse than Yerovam ben Nevat, who was appointed by a Navi. But what was so bad about Yerovam ben Nevat? He split the kingdom and he built the Agalim in Beit El and Dan, which was an alternate Beit HaMikdash. The Navi makes fun of them, calling them Agalim, but he built it for serving God. It wasn't idol worship. It might have been, the two types of Avodah Zarah. There's Avodah Zarah and Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is serving another God. Avodah Zarah is serving our God the wrong way. You follow my point? You can be Jewish and daven in shul and daven to God, but go to, let's say you're a chassid, davening by a misnagid or vice versa. You can serve God, but serve him in the wrong way. Or you can serve another God. Beit El and Dan is serving the God of Israel, but in the way that God isn't happy with. Now, and there's reasons for the split of the kingdom. But Yerovoam's big reform to change these things is he makes an alternate place of worship. And that splits the kingdom religiously, which leads to a terrible result. Yirmiyahu does such a good job of pointing that out, that when we come back in the Second Temple period, Yerushalayim is the only place for the temple. There are no more bamot. No matter how good a king is, he might even get an A. He might get a pass. Usually it's a pass-fail system. Even the good kings of Yehuda, what's it say? V'yaseh Hashem ben Hashem, rak habamot lasaru. And who gets an A+? The only A+ is going to be Chizkiyahu and Yoshiel, because they get rid of the bamot. And David gets the biggest A+ because he's the first one who establishes Yerushalayim. So what we're going to find is anyone who's able to establish Yerushalayim as a place to serve God, Chizkiyahu gets rid of all the bamot, opens Yerushalayim up for the people up north. Yoshiel rebuilds Yerushalayim, gets rid of all the idol worship, and gets rid of all the bamot. So any king who gets rid of the bamot, that's what's good. By the time the book is over, the temple is destroyed, but when they come back, there's only one place to serve God in Yerushalayim. Now, and if you, let's say you decide to build a temple in Shechem, you're not Jewish anymore. It's no longer Avodah Zarah, but it becomes Avodah Zarah, if you know the story of the Shomronim. Now, that's one word in general. The kings that we're going to deal with, who are the kings in your time in this section of Sefer Melachim? There's lots of them, aren't there? Who do we have? Who are the kings of Israel? Well, we lose that. The house of Ahab falls apart. So Ahab had two kids who took over. In the beginning of Melachim, his sort of the worst son didn't reign very long, and he died right away. And then Yoram ben Ahab, who wasn't as bad as his brother, not the greatest, but definitely not as bad as beforehand. He's one who dies. Who kills Yoram ben Ahab? Yehu kills him. And then who becomes who takes over from the house of Ahab? Yehu. And he has a son, Achaziel, and he has a son, Yoash, and he has a son, Yerovam ben Yoash. That's always called, that second Yerovam is always called Yerovam ben Yoash, his name. And those are all, in Sefer Melachim, the Nabi says they're bad, even though a lot of them are pretty good. And we have to talk about that time period. The goal is to understand that time period. And who are the kings in Yehuda at the same time? So Yoshaphat was a good king in the time of Ahab. And he had a son. Also, he had a Yehoram, right? And his grandson, Achaziel. And they all get killed by Yehu, kills the kings of Yehuda. And there's one little kid left over, Yoash. Remember, Natalia takes over the kingdom for a while. Then Yoash takes over, and then Amaziah takes over. And then we get to Uzziah, and things are good again. But it's very confusing. Agreed? I just wanted to go over, I'm assuming you're reading it, those are the kings. But even if you read it, it's confusing, and they're always going back and forth. Now, what I want to do in this year is try to understand what's going on from a prophetic point of view to help make sense of what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to spend about 10 minutes on this little sine wave. And sort of cheating the sine wave because it explains the whole book. But I'll explain let me explain, take a minute and explain what we're looking at. First of all, let's identify what we have. We have a sine wave going from left to right. And what is the x-axis on the sine wave? That's time. And therefore, on the left, Sefer Shoftim. When it's over, the end of Sefer Melachim. Okay? Now, therefore, I begin with the end of the times of the Shoftim. We get the beginning of the kingdom, David Shlomo, and we end with Churban Abayit in the time of Tzidkiyahu. Now, what's the y-axis? That's what's complicated. There was based on the chart, what am I measuring in y? Like Shlomo is a high point. Yehoshaphat and Ahab is almost that high. Uzziah and Rehoboam is almost that high. What's happening then? Okay. It's not how firm they are. It's not only how firm they are. It relates to that. But basically, I'd call it the state of the union, or state of the country. How good is life in Israel? Meaning, how good is the economy? How good is security? How good is life? If life is good, if it's a good country to live in, and during all these time periods, there's no war, no civil war for sure, and if there's wars with the enemies, we're winning them. Life is good in Israel. What's the bottom? When we reach rock bottom, that's either civil war or getting defeated by our enemies. And that's the ups and downs. So basically, things are good. Things are really bad in the time of the Shoftim. They get better with the kingdom starting. Shlomo is like a high point in Jewish history. Things fall apart with the split kingdom, with Yerovam. Things get better again when Yehoshaphat and Ahab decide to work together. Well, you mentioned whenever the northern king and southern kingdom decide to work together, the country prospers, which is a logical reason. When Yehu revolts, everything falls apart, and that's what we're going to focus on, that big fall, which will be key to understanding this section of Sefer Melachim. Then we're going to get to Uzziah and Yerovam working together again, and things go good. Then that all falls apart with a short taking over. And then there's a small recovery with Chizkiyahu, a bigger recovery with Yoshiyahu, and then everything falls apart again. So that's the y-axis. Now, on the very bottom I have the Nevi'im, with not all of them, but most of the Nevi'im of those time periods. And on top we have the superpowers. What would a prophet expect, or what would a Jew expect who believes in God? Should there be a correlation between the y-axis and our religious behavior? If you read Shema every day? What a prophet would expect is that when things are good, that's a sign the Jewish people are doing well. And when things are bad, it's a sign they're not following God. And I would expect, it's called a linear relationship, or a linear correlation between how good life is and how frum we are, how religious we are. What? But it's not true. And the prophets have a problem, understand? Because there is no correlation, or no obvious correlation, because we can have kings who are very religious, like Chizkiyahu, and the worst things happen. Ashur comes and wipes them out. I can have terrible kings like Ahab, who has no chelek l'olam haba in Masechet Sanhedrin, and things have never been better. So for the Jew, for a God-fearing Jew, or any Jew living in Israel at the time, who would expect to see a correlation, doesn't see it. And therefore, who has a problem? The prophets. And the prophets have to explain, why is it that sometimes things go good even though we're bad? And how come sometimes things go bad even though we're good? And welcome to religion. Or a shul rabbi, or every teacher. You follow? How do you explain things like that? We expect a linear correlation. We expect but we call that midat hadin. But there's a price you pay for midat hadin. No. If you want things to be good when you're good, then you have to expect things to be bad when you're bad. And if you want to be able to survive when you're bad and get another chance, if you want things to be good even when you're bad, there's a price you pay sometimes. Sometimes things are bad even when you're good. Because it's not a linear relationship. It should be. We'll see how the Nevi'im are going to deal with that. Now, who are the Nevi'im? We'll see them on the bottom. Pretty much those are the different time periods. Our time period is going to be basically Elisha is our time period. But we'll talk about Eliyahu and Elisha. One last thing. On the top boxes, I have the superpowers in the Middle East at the time. The Plishtim was a big enemy in the time of Sefer Shoftim. That's very well known. The split kingdom in the time of Yerovam, our arch enemy is Egypt. Paro Shesha comes and basically rips the country apart. Aram is the one who destroys, who basically is the arch enemy in the time of Sefer Melachim Bet that you're studying now, in the first half of Melachim Bet. Ashur is going to be the arch enemy coming up in the time of Achaz and Chizkiyahu, till Yoshiyahu, and then finally we have the Babylonians. Now, if I want to understand the reasons for the ups and downs, the question is, I'm always going to look for a correlation. You might remember, like in the Wall Street Journal, and what's it called? Any newspaper that has the stock market. You see these graphs all the time? If you have friends who are investment bankers, they're looking at computer screens with these kind of charts all the time, aren't they? What are they looking for? They're looking for correlations. And if they can figure out what causes the market to go up and what causes it to go down, hey, I can make a hedge fund. I can make money and support a yeshiva. I can do. The question is, what's the correlation? Now, the question is going to be, what's the reason for the ups and downs? And if I look at this chart, the answer seems to be very simple. Whenever there's a superpower in the Middle East, what happens? Things are down. And whenever there's no superpower, or when the superpowers are fighting, things are up. Like if Iraq is fighting with Iran, and Syria is fighting with Turkey, whatever it is, then things are quiet in Israel. When they're all doing well, and when they're not fighting, and when there's a big superpower, we can be in trouble. Therefore, if I want to plan policy, one thing I could do is simply pick the superpower. Do I go with Egypt? Do I go with Bavel? Do I go with Ashur? In other words, I can take this information and reach a lot of conclusions. In the books of the Nevi'im, we have to deal with what conclusion they're going to reach. So that's our setup for for the chart. No, I want to use the chart to review everything in Sefer Melachim up until this point, and then we'll focus up on our time period of King Yehu and Yehu's revolt. What enabled the rise of power in the time of Shlomo Melech? Well, establishing the kingdom pretty much did the job. When Sefer Shmuel began, the Plishtim were our arch enemy. Not only had they taken over the coastal plain, they've infiltrated the mountain range. If you remember the first battles, they were in Michmas, they're already in Binyamin. They're an existential threat to the people. Things are so bad that people are willing to have a king. In fact, they're demanding a king. For what reason? Because they want an army. They want a king who's going to fight the battles. The Navi's worried, hey, you give him a king, and the king will be successful. Oh my gosh, they'll never need God. Because what kept us from during the time of the Shoftim? We had trouble. We davened. We finally turned to God when things were in trouble. If we have a king who solves our problems, we'll never turn to God. That's why the Navi's reluctant. God says, if you don't have a king, you'll never be a nation. Give him a king. But find a king who will be successful, but attribute the success to God. So Shaul was a successful king, but doesn't know how to attribute it to God. He attributes more to himself. It's his kavod that's more important than God's. David is the king who is even more successful in battle, but everything that he does and every success that he has, he attributes to God, and that's Sefer Tehillim in a nutshell. Because what makes David the cutting edge and a king is a king who's number one, successful, but number two, takes all of his success and attributes to God. And therefore, it's not a king leading the people away from God, leading the people to God, but at the same time, gets the country on its feet. And then we can fulfill our goal as God's nation to bring a message to mankind. So that's when things are good, and Shlomo is the high point. Then we have the split of the kingdom. At the end of the days of Shlomo, things go bad. Shlomo's punishment is the split of the kingdom. But the split of the kingdom leads to the fall. Now, there's something we need to explain, which will explain the title of this year. Remember the title of this year? I thought it was cute. Remember? There's Jezebel, Jezebel, Israel, and Yisrael. And it's a little confusing. And the goal, I want you to understand what's going on, but there's one thing you have to understand. Israel's location in the Middle East is very, 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 what's the word? Not more important. It's very not crucial. What's the word? It's very better than critical. Very strategic. Meaning, it's very important because there's the great centers of civilization are Egypt and Mesopotamia. There's trade between those two centers. And the main highway that connects Egypt and Mesopotamia goes through the land of Israel. It hugs the coastal plain, from Egypt, Ashkelon, Ashdod, past Tel Aviv, up to Hadera. And then it has to cut into Syria. It cuts through what's called Wadi Ara, if you know that area, up to Megiddo. And then there's a big wide plain called Emek Yisrael. And that's the main highway that Megiddo protects. That's the main highway that takes you go north of the Kinneret. You get to Chatzor, and then you get to the Golan, and you're in Damascus, right past Katzrin. And that's the way to go to Damascus. If you want to go to the Gilad, you go south of the Kinneret to Beit Shan, and you're in the Gilad. But that's, Emek Yisrael is, from a strategic point of view, is key. Economically, Emek Yisrael is the breadbasket of Israel. That's the name, Yisrael, just not Yisrael, Yisrael. Yisra, planting. It's like planted by God. It's the best grain. The grain is so good that in Sefer Shoftim we had grain crashers. You know grain crashers? Remember there's a movie, Wedding Crashers? Yeah. What's a grain crasher? The Jews planted the fields in Emek Yisrael, and when it was harvest season, who came to do the harvest for us? All B'nai Kedem, Midian and B'nai Kedem came in from the east, and came and took all the grain, and we were outnumbered. And things were so bad, he had people like Yidon were taking the grain and keeping it private because the enemy kept on coming and taking it until we won that big battle. Now, but that area of Emek Yisrael is key for international trade. If we control that highway, we're sitting pretty. And every high point here, time of Shlomo, the time of Ahab and Yehoshaphat, the time of Uzziah and Yerovam, we control that highway. Got it? When we control the highway, we have to be united. To be able to control the highway, the country has to be united. The north and south have to work together. Because otherwise we're fighting with each other. If we're fighting with each other, we can't control the highway. Someone else comes and takes over the highway. It's either going to be Egypt or Aram or Ashur or Bavel. And that's why the borders of Israel during the time of Sefer Menachem are either very big, we have the whole country, and we're a superpower, and we're strong and powerful. That's what happened. Or we shrink to the mountain range. We're basically from Shechem, like Yudan and Shomron, the mountain range, and that's it. And we lose everything else. It's one or the other, and that's why the derivative, if you know what that is. You don't know what derivatives are. That's the rate of change. You learn that in math? When you measure that. That's why the derivative is so high. That's why the rate of change is so fast. Either your high point or your low point. You rarely get a normal thing. Either you're real good or real bad. And there's a logical reason for that. And as you mentioned before, when the countries united and the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom work together, that's another reason why things are good. Achdut. When we're fighting with each other, we're taking our resources to fight with each other, and then the other enemies take over the highway and things are finished. Now, what's the job of the Nevi'im? The job of the Nevi'im is to relate all this to God. And now we're ready to understand what happens next. So Shlomo's punishment for not following God the right way all the way at the end of his kingdom and letting his foreign wives get to him, and which led to idol worship, God punishes him by splitting the kingdom with his children. That split kingdom leads to Egypt taking over and everything falling apart. And the biggest trouble was there's a giant civil war in the time of Aviyah, you might remember. Asa and Baasha are fighting all the time. Things hit rock bottom with a big civil war. Now we're almost ready for our time period. And this is going to this will explain Izebel and half of Menachem Aleph and half of Menachem Bet, the first half of Menachem Bet. Ahab is the first king to reunite the kingdom after the first split. After married Yerovam, things are really bad for several decades. The first king to unite the country and put us back on the map is going to be Ahab. Ahab has the following strategy, which works like a charm. I'm assuming you've discussed it. I want to make sure it's understood. What is Ahab's strategy? Number one, peace with Yehuda. He does that. In fact, their kids marry each other off. Okay? But economically, he's a genius. What does he do? He makes a treaty with Lebanon, with Sidon, which is the big port city, which has the whole Levant and the whole shipping of the Mediterranean. He makes an economic treaty with the king of Sidon. And to finish that treaty, like they did in ancient times, he has to marry the daughter of the king. So the king of Sidon had a daughter, and her name was Trash Can. Was Izebel, right? Which later becomes a trash can. Okay. Izebel in Hebrew was trash. Okay. Her name was Jezebel, or Izebel. Ahab didn't marry her because he needed someone to make cholent or keep him. It wasn't a classic wife. It was a political treaty. Like all Shlomo's wives, it's the same idea. And I'll be mean, every wife comes with a price tag. That wasn't nice, but if you guys know what I mean. I mean like this. Every political treaty comes with a price tag. You want to work with Lebanon, you have to take their culture. And therefore, together with Izebel, what's her price tag? 400 Nevi'ei Baal, 450 Nevi'ei Asherah. Meaning, what does she come with? You want to be part of the new Middle East? You have to come with McDonald's, with fast food, with Hollywood. You understand? I'll explain if you want to understand how the whole Middle East crisis began, Western countries came in and took over, or sort of controlled after World War II, controlled the whole Middle East. The fundamental, or the most basic Islamic values were being destroyed by that culture. Family values were destroyed. They didn't want all that Hollywood stuff. They didn't want all this American stuff. They didn't want all the movies. They didn't want the culture. They didn't want all that. And at the very beginning of it, there was a religious movement. There were B'nai Nevi'im against. Now, later it became politicized and became a power struggle. But I don't want to get. But in the very beginning, there was a lot of logic why they were against Western influence, because it ruined family structure, it ruined family values, it ruined the religion. People would stop being religious and following Islam properly. What it led to later on, that's already more modern history. I want to use that simply for analogy to understand what's happening in Israel. Sidon, and the king of Sidon, and Izebel think, if we want to be part of this new Middle East and be part of this big trade and this growth, you have to follow Middle East culture, which is serving Baal and Asherah. Who are they? Those are, Baal's the rain god, Asherah's the fertility god. Basically, it means praying for rain and praying for fertility. Basically, those are gods of the economy. Now, in Egypt, there was no Baal god because they had a Nile god. Nile gave them the river. In Israel, in our area, you need rain. And therefore, there's a rain god. The economy is prospering during that time. Ahab has the land connections. He has the Via Maris down to Egypt. He has the roads open all the way to Mesopotamia. And it's a win-win for everybody. He has a treaty with Aram after they win a couple battles. Aram, he has chutzot in Aram. He has, what do you call that? Trade outposts in Aram. Things are going wonderful. Things have never been better. The problem is, it only showed the people Avodat Baal is worth it. As soon as they made this treaty with Sidon, Israel's economy jumped leaps and bounds. Life is good in Israel. And Ahab is the most popular king Israel ever had. He's the strongest, the best. Things are united. Things were never so good since the time of Shlomo Melech. The problem is, religion starts falling apart. Now, Izebel, with her Nivei Baal, wanted to bring in this Phoenician influence into the country. And who was fighting her? No, the Nevi'im, the Bnei Nevi'im. And she began to persecute them because they're ruining her whole reform. And therefore, the Bnei Nevi'im have to go into hiding. And they're being persecuted. So there's people in the government like Ovadia who keeps a couple yeshivot open. But basically, the whole Bnei Nevi'im, anyone trying to keep the old-fashioned Torah tradition, is being persecuted. Until Eliyahu, their leader, says enough is enough. What's Eliyahu trying to do? Eliyahu tries to do a surgical operation. He wants to keep the prosperity and sort of get rid of the shiksa, if you understand what I mean. Yes. He says, if I can only get rid of Izebel, if I can only take Izebel and get rid of her, but leave everything the way it is, we have it. We have it. Now, what had Izebel? What Izebel was very influential, but the main thing she brought was Avodat Baal, which was rain. What does Eliyahu decide to do? I want to prove to you, you don't need Izebel. You don't need these Nevei Baal. And they're ruining your country. What does he do? He stops the rain. And everyone knows that Eliyahu stopped the rain. How do they know that Eliyahu did it? He said he was going to do it. It wasn't after it happened he says, oh, it was me. He said, I'm stopping the rain until I say go. Now, they all know Eliyahu has superpowers. You follow? They all know that. And that's why they hate the guy. You would think they should believe in him because, hey, look, he says he's going to do a miracle and he does a miracle. And that's why they hate him. You have superpowers and you're using it to hurt your own people? You understand what that's why Ahab calls him, you're Ochar Yisrael. And Ahab sends out search parties to find this guy to stop the curse. They want the antidote. Everyone hates Eliyahu because he stopped the rain. He ruined their economy. It's a disaster what he does. And then when they finally get to the showdown in Har Carmel, what happens? He wants to prove to them who's ruining the country. And Eliyahu was sure, if I can do this big miracle, right, and have God answer that korban on Har Carmel. We had the Haftarah a couple weeks ago. What's going to happen? Well, they'll be believers. They'll get rid of his. What's he hoping for? God would answer his prayer. He'd kill all the Nevei Baal. God would bring rain, and everyone would be religious again. And Izebel would go away. And the people would get rid of Izebel. He does a big miracle, and what's everyone respond? Remember, Hashem Hu Elohim? And what's really neat, we have a minhag which follows. When do we repeat that line, Hashem Hu Elohim? Yeah, at the end. And it's a great minhag. You know why? I'm saying in jest. Right? Because it lasts one day. If you understand Yom Kippur, that was supposed to be a joke. But it's a great minhag. You do something, it's a big day, but it lasts one day and you're back to good old ways again. What I'm getting at is, the next day, after everyone says Hashem Hu Elohim, what is Eliyahu hoping that will happen? Ahab will now accept God and will get rid of Izebel. And the people get rid of Izebel. What's Izebel say the next day? She puts out a warrant for Eliyahu's arrest. And no one stands up for Eliyahu. And Eliyahu has to run away for his life. What's that mean? He failed. The people didn't get the message. It didn't work because it was too harsh. His failure was so bad he wants to die, remember? And he runs away. And now we're finally ready for the time of Yehu. God tells Eliyahu three things. First, Eliyahu comes and resigns, and God accepts his resignation, doesn't he? He says he was at Kanai, he says, Kano kineti. Eliyahu took the keys to the rain. He thought he was doing the right thing. God accepts his resignation, but he tells him three things he has to do. Who remembers the three? Make Elisha, the Navi, to take over, which he's not so crazy about. Make Hazael the king of Syria, of Aram, and make you the king of Israel. And it doesn't happen so fast, does it? It doesn't happen the next day. It's going to take decades till that happens. What? No. His kids, his disciples do it. It takes a long time till it happens. Now, what I want to show you today, we finally got to our topic. What was Eliyahu's goal? Eliyahu's goal was to get rid of Izebel and bring the people back to God. It's going to take about 25 years to get rid of Izebel. Who's going to do it? The people, not just Jehu. There's going to be a people's revolt against the house of Ahab and Izebel and all the Nevei Baal. And the people are going to be 100% behind it. It's going to take 20 years. You understand? During Izebel's time, during Ahab's time, Izebel was too popular because she put butter on the table. She put bread on the table. You follow? Izebel was popular because she was successful. And Ahab's treaty with her was successful. Ahab couldn't do anything to Izebel. Eliyahu was hoping almost the impossible, that we would just commit economic suicide and accept God. They didn't accept that. 20 years later, the people were sick of Ahab's kids. Ahab was great, his kids, they're all spoiled. It's classic phenomena. When Yehu has his revolt, it's a people's revolt. If you read the story, the people were behind Yehu. It's a people's revolt, and we'll talk about how Elisha gets it started. And what Eliyahu was hoping to happen after he did his miracle on Har Carmel is exactly what happens God's way 20 years later. And what's God tell him when he runs away to Har Sinai, to Har Chorev? Let me show you how I run things. You want to do it with Bidat Adin, you want to do it the easy way, with a big miracle and the harsh way. Things don't work that way. I'll do it my way. Now, those three things are going to explain the next sections of Sefer Melachim. Because what were the three? Make Elisha the Navi instead of you, Hazael the king of Aram, and Yehu the king of Israel. Something very strange happens afterwards in Sefer Melachim. That's the end of Melachim Aleph. Melachim Bet, the very beginning, there's an entire section where the main topic is Elisha. And that was the last set of topics you learned, wasn't it? Well, the story of Elisha begins in Perek Bet with Eliyahu leaving, in the Basara Shemaima. That's Melachim Bet, when he leaves, crossing the Jordan. Eliyahu himself isn't so crazy about Elisha taking over. You notice that? Yeah. Elisha's hanging on. Eliyahu says, leave me alone, basically. And then Elisha wants to be his successor. Remember, I want Pishnaim, I want to be the chief Navi. And the Navim in Beit El don't want him. Remember, they make fun of him. When they say when they call him Baldy, you know that story? Yeah, they're not making fun of the fact he's bald. You realize that, I hope. When they call him, Kerech, when they call him Baldy, what are they saying? You're not Eliyahu, because Eliyahu had a lot of hair. They weren't making fun of him because he was bald. They're saying you're not Eliyahu, because they want me that they're Beit Shammai, if you follow. Elisha's Beit Hillel. Right? Elisha's Mr. Nice Guy. Now, the Nevim in Yericho accept Elisha, because they see Nachal Ruach Hashem Eliyahu. The Nevim in Beit El didn't see that. That's why Elisha's so angry when they don't accept him. Now, but Elisha becomes the next Navi, and God affirms it when he crosses the Yarden. After Elisha's Navi, from Perek Bet through Perek Het, I have a set of Prakim, which I guess you studied in last year, and there's one thing that they all share in common. They're all Sipurei Elisha. In fact, it's called Megillat Elisha. We don't even know who the king is, except for Perek Gimel, but from Prakim Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, and Chet, there's Melech Yisrael, we don't know his name. Well, I'll show you later on, the kings are probably from the house of Yehu. But there's an entire section where all we hear about are Maseh Elisha, or Nisei Elisha. Remember? Perek Gimel is in the battle with Edom and against Moab, together with Edom and Yehuda. Elisha does the miracle and brings water when they ran out of water. In Perek Bet, Perek Dalet, Hey, Vav, and Zayin, he's a miracle man, isn't he? There's no precedent to that in the entire Tanakh. Where you have a Navi, just goes around doing miracles all day long. In the New Testament, it's a big thing. In the Old Testament, fact, that's exactly what they model him after. If you know you should know that stuff. Even the names are similar. Yeah. Why is it that Elisha has to do all these miracles? It's unheard of. Someone drops a hammer, and the hammer comes up from the bottom of the Jordan. There's not enough food for people to eat. Remember? There's one bowl of shul, then it's enough for the whole shul. Remember? There's an almanah can't pay off her debt. Her husband was a rabbi, and he died, probably killed by Izebel. And remember what saves her life? The little thing of oil. Another miracle. We find there's no other Navi doing miracles like that. With Abram, with the four. Every story about miracle after miracle, and there's one theme always through. People have to know Sheyesh Navi B'Yisrael. I want to explain to you why that section is so important. First of all, that section is Elisha the Navi instead of Eliyahu. And if you know the parallels, that's a classic shir. Everything Eliyahu does, Elisha does twice as many. It's similar, but twice as many. And it's a cute little. That's for Iyun when you do Megillat Elisha compared to Eliyahu. Rav Semet has a whole book on it. It's classic stuff. Now, why is that section so important? Because the rest of the next section of Sefer Melachim is going to be organized by those three missions that God tells Eliyahu. The first section is Elisha, the Navi instead of you. What's the last Elisha story? Elisha is sitting in front of the king of Israel and doing what? Telling Sipurei Elisha. Not Elisha. Gehazi. The beginning of Parachet. If you take a look in Parachet, that's our first parak, isn't it? In the beginning of Parachet, Elisha is sitting in front of the king, telling Elisha's stories. Remember, the king asked him, "Tell me Elisha's stories." Now, who's this king? It didn't say who the king's name is, but it's got to be a king from the house of Yehu. We'll see why later on, because kings from the house of Ahab wouldn't be asking to tell him Elisha's stories, because they hated each other. The house of Ahab and Eliyahu and Elisha. Remember, Elisha says in that one battle, he says when when Yoram, the king of Ben Ahab, is there, he said, "I'm not going to look at you. Go to your father's gods. I'm only going to listen to the king of Israel. I'll do a miracle for him." Most likely, that's a king from the house of Yehu. We'll try to identify that later on. But he says he starts telling stories about Elisha, and sure enough, that lady who he told her there's a famine coming, leave the country and come back, and then she's coming back crying about her field. She comes into the king about her field, and Gehazi says, "Hey, that's exactly, that's the lady I was talking about," and she got her field back. But that ends what's called Megillat Elisha. Now look in Parachet now. That story is Parachet, the first 6 psukim. Now look at the beginning, just the first line of Parachet. Elisha told the lady who brought the kid back to life, go live somewhere else because there's a famine coming up. And then, she comes back 7 years later. Okay, and then look at Pasuk Daled. V'melech medaber Gehazi nar ish Elohim lemor saprana li et kol hagdolot asher asa Elisha. The king says, "I want to hear Elisha's stories from Gehazi." By the way, it's 7 years after. It can't be. There aren't enough years for this story to fit during the time of Ahab, during the time of Yoram ben Ahab. But it's too complicated for now. We don't have to take my word for it for now. And he tells the story. Now, that ends Megillat Elisha. What happens in Parachet Pasuk Zayin? Elisha now, what's his job here? Okay. He goes to Damascus, and who's the king of Damascus? Who's the king of Aram? Ben-Hadad. Okay. And he's getting sick, and he sends Hazael, the head of his army, to go ask him what's going to be. Now, Elisha made a name for himself. He's famous. Everyone knows Elisha is Mr. Miracle Worker. What's Elisha's job now to do? Anoint Hazael, the king of Aram. And he tells him how to do it. What's he tell him? He tells Hazael, go tell your boss what? You're gonna live, but you need to know that what? He's gonna die. Which is a nice way of telling him. Sort of. Or maybe let him die an unnatural death. What does he do? You know what happens next, doesn't he? He comes up he goes bathing and he covers him, dries him off with a towel and happens to cover his mouth by accident. And he's not able to breathe. Whatever it is, he dies. You know the story in Parachet? So that's how he dies. There's an argument. Did Elisha tell him to do it? Was that exactly Eli's point, or that's how he understood Eliyahu? You can argue. Whatever it is, that's the next thing that God told Eliyahu, wasn't it? Elisha, Navi Tachtecha, that's Megillat Elisha through Perichet. The middle of Perichet is Chazal, the king of Aram. Once Chazal becomes the king of Aram, what's that going to cause? That's going to cause trouble for Israel, because there's going to be fight in the Gilad. And the Jewish people hate fighting to this day, hate fighting battles they don't have to be fighting. Okay? If there's a battle where our existence is under threat, if there's an existential threat from an enemy, they're throwing bombs at us, they're trying to kill us as a nation, and we go to war to protect ourselves, everyone joins in. If we go to war that we don't have to fight, like remember the first Lebanon war, when we're doing a political war or to expand our borders, then it's very hard to get consensus among the nation, and there's a good reason for that. Now, what's happening? Ahab, the house of Ahab, is fighting battles in the Gilad, trying to expand the borders again back into Syria, and the army doesn't like it. You understand? Ahab's kids, Yoram ben Ahab, is not like his father. He's fighting battles that people don't like it. And the army generals don't like it. And Elisha's onto this. Now that Elisha is a Navi, and Chazal is the king of Aram, giving Israel trouble militarily, the setting is ready now for a coup d'etat. Now we're in the beginning of Perek Tet already? No, yeah, we're in the beginning of Perek Tet. And we have the setting in the meantime, with who the kings are. Again, who are the kings now? Yoram ben Ahab is the king of Israel. Achaziel is the king of Yehuda, the son of Yehoshaphat, or the grandson of Yehoshaphat. And the army is fighting in the Gilad. The king is recuperating from wounds he got in the battle in Emek Israel. What happens? Elisha now sends one of his Narim, means one of his students. That means a little kid, means a student, a younger guy, to go to the battlefield. Now, why can't Elisha do it himself? The word is treason. You know what treason is? Even if he's a rabbi and well known, if a rabbi starts inciting to change a government and bring down a government, things like that happen to this day. But it's not a safe thing to do. And any king who respects his kingdom, no matter how great a rabbi is, if he tries to undermine the kingdom, he'll ask Shaul, remember? Shaul, remember ask Shmuel. God tells Shmuel to anoint David. What Shmuel say? Saul's going to find out and he'll kill me. So let's go make up a story. You know the story, don't you? But David has to be anointed in a clandestine way. Elisha can't go himself to appoint and say there's a new king. But he can test the waters. What does he do? He sends one of his Narim. He says, go there, you'll be less suspicious. If I come, no, it's going to be too suspicious. And he can't run so fast either. Elisha is probably older. The young kid comes, his Nar, calls Yehu, the general, who's in charge of the army up there, brings him into the tent, and tells him secretly that what? You're king. And your job as king is to get the house of Ahab back for what they did wrong. God's angry with the house of Ahab for all the idol worship they brought in, and I've had it with them. Now, why can't Elisha do that? Why can't the Nar do that in public? What's he afraid of? Why can't he just tell Yehu, God said you're king? Because they'll kill the guy, you follow? That's treason. If there's a threat, they might kill him. What does Elisha tell him to do? Go in there, anoint him, tell him, and run away before he has a chance to do anything. He does it secretly. That gives him time to run away because he's testing the waters. It might work, it might not work. Yehu steps out, and what's he say? What's everyone ask him? What did this rabbi have to say? He said, oh, he's Meshuggah. Don't listen to him. He says, and they no, tell us what he really said. What's that mean? They're itching. You follow? They're itching to revolt. And Yehu is covering his bases. What's he saying? Listen, he told me I'm king. I'm not revolting, but he told me he's king. And right away, what happens? All the generals and all the army people, what do? You follow? Now, that's not happening in a vacuum. That's what I want to explain. What the Navi is doing, he's not starting the revolt. He's simply lighting the match. The straw's there already. Things are ripe for a revolt. The question is testing the waters. Is it ready? Who decides on the revolt? It's the people's revolt. And that's why everyone joins him like that. And when Yehu marches onto the king, everyone joins him. And when the king, remember, who's in Emek Israel now, when the king sees this army coming, they're not sure who it is. They send out messengers to what's going on. And everyone they send out, they join the bandwagon. And you see in that story, there's a people's revolt against the house of Yehu, against the house of Ahab. Ahab's kids, and all the big shots of the country. That's a people's revolt, like in all good revolutions, against the leadership. That's what Eliyahu was hoping would happen after Har Carmel. It happened some 20 years later with Elisha, and now the people were right for it. And what did God do? We made Elisha the Navi, Chazal the king of Aram, Yehu the king of Israel, and what did they all do? They get rid of the house of Ahab, and guess who has to go? What's going to be the big event? Izebel. Now, what does Izebel do? Yehu's coming in, and he kills the king, doesn't he? Remember, he shoots him, he kills him. He kills the king of Yehuda, who's his ally. Right? How about Izebel? What'd she do? Remember? What? She puts on her makeup, right? She puts on her sheitel, the whole thing. It gets all set up, hoping that what? What did she say? It's a great line. Remember? Zimri horeg al dunav. She knows her Jewish history. She had learned that to get the shidduch. Right? She went to the IDC. She went, to learn Jewish history beforehand. What does she know? This isn't the first time in Jewish history where a general rebels against, there's a coup d'etat, and a general takes over the kingdom. Who did it? Zimri horeg al dunav. Which means, what's her position going to be? You're not going to break your ties with Sidon, with Lebanon. You need us. So basically, I'm still queen. And she sort of welcomes her new husband. That's the classic way they understand. Isn't that the classic way they explain it? She's getting all dressed up, saying she's welcoming her new husband. Now, what's Yehu really going to do? He's going to get her killed. Remember? And he in a minute he finds volunteers to push her out the window. Now, a student of mine who teaches now in a different school, who's a female teacher. I don't know if I should quote her. I guess it's okay. I forget her name though. No, Lisa. When she teaches this, I would never think of something like this, but I want to share it with you because you'll appreciate it. She says she knows she's dead, but she's dressing up for a funeral. You understand that? He said only a female teacher could come up would understand it that way. Or somebody who saw what's those people in England with Henry VIII what was her name? Don't they when they go to get their head cut off, they get dressed up real nice and put their makeup on? Because they're going to be in public. Again, I just want to share that with you because I thought it was cute. You'd probably appreciate it. But I still think Pshanda is the regular way she thinks that she's going to be queen. But it's a nice little take on the side. She's dressing for a funeral. Now, what I want to the key point is he's looking for volunteers, and he finds them in a second, don't they? They push out the window. Right? She gets trampled by the horses or by the dogs, and the dogs eat her flesh. And then, as a joke, he would say, maybe they're in the middle of eating, they have a Sudat mitzvah, and they say, maybe we should go bury her. And sure enough, there's nothing left. And remember, and when she killed it in the field of Navot, and it's like midah keneged midah. What basically Yehu was able to do, he wipes out the house of Ahab. He gets rid of Avodat Baal. He gets Nevei Baal. He locks them all in a church and burns them down. Remember that story? The whole house of Ahab, the 70 kids. Remember? They get the people to do the dirty work. Remember? But the way the people are working together with Yehu, the cooperation he has with the people, is so obvious and it's so massive that you see 20 years later, the people hate their leaders. It wasn't like that in the time of Ahab. It's like that way 15, 20 years later with his kids. Eliyahu tried to do it prematurely. Now, what's going to happen next? What should the people expect to happen now that Elisha appointed Yehu as king? Yehu gets rid of all the Avodat Baal, doesn't he? Wipes it all out. It's all gone, finished. He gets rid of all of the house of Ahab and all of his. I want you to read one pasuk. Look in Perek Yud. After the bloodbath, before he gets to. Actually, we'll read this the end of Perek Tet, so you see what we're talking about. Perek Tet pasuk Lamed. Perek Tet, chapter 9, verse 30. V'yavo Yehu Yezre'el. Yehu comes to make Israel. V'Izebel Shama. There's Yisrael and Izebel. See the words next to each other? That was the title. Ve'vo Yisrael v'Izebel sham'a v'tasem b'puch chinea v'teitev et rosha v'tashkei parachalon. That's the, you follow, she got herself all dressed up. Ve'yu bam b'shar v'tomer hashalom zimri horeg adunav. And v'yisa panav elachalon v'yomer mi iti, who's with me, v'ashkifu elav shnaim shosha sarisim, v'yomer shimtua v'yishmatua. Right? They basically shove her out the window, and her blood goes down the thing, and the horses trample her. And then he sits down to eat, and says, "Oh, let's go bury her," and there's nothing left. And then he says, "What?" And what's his name? Pasuk Lamed Vav. Vayeshuvu ve'agidu lo vayomer dvar Hashem hu asher diber biyad abdo Eliyahu tishbi lemor bechelik Yisrael yichlu klavim et besar Izebel. V'tani v'lat Izebel kudom al pnei hasadeh bechelik Yisrael asher lo yomru zot Izebel. There's no memorial in memory of Izebel in Emek Yisrael. But it goes back to Eliyahu. See that? Eliyahu's goal was to get rid of Izebel. Eliyahu tried surgically to get rid of Izebel, and he didn't work. He did it too harshly. God tells him 3 things, and when they're over, Izebel's gone. It takes several decades, but he gets the job done. Now, then Perek Yud is the 70 sons of Ahab, 70 sons of Ahab, and then Pasuk Yud Aleph, chapter 10, Perek Yud, Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayechihu et kol hanisharim lebeit Ahab b'Yisrael. Kol gdolav u'miyuda'av v'chonav ad b'ti asher lo sarid. V'ekam v'yavo v'yelech Shomron hu v'ekel haroim b'derech v'yu matzat achei Chaziel melech Yehuda v'miyatem v'imra achei Chaziel anachnu v'nirsholu b'nei HaMelech, and he kills the house, all the royal family of Yehuda, which will lead to a big problem in a minute. And then he finds Yonadab and Rechav, and they says, what's he tell him? Come with me, and I'll show you. In Pasuk Tet Zayin, V'yomer l'cha iti v'orei b'kinati l'Hashem v'akivu oto b'richbo. And he's on a bloodbath. And one more line, Pasuk Yud Zayin, V'yavo Shomron v'yachet kol nishrim l'cha b'Shomron ad yishmido kidvar Hashem asher diber el Eliyahu. See, going back to Eliyahu every time? And then Yehu gets all the Baal together and makes sure everyone is only of the Baal, and then he burns them down in the church, and that's it for them. Pasuk Lamed, V'yomer Hashem, in Perek Yud Pasuk Lamed, V'yomer Hashem el Yehu, Yana shativot lasot hayashar beinai, kol asher b'levi asita lebeit Achav, b'nei yeshvu l'cha kisei Yisrael. You did such a good job getting rid of the house of Achav and Izebel. 4 generations, you'll be the longest dynasty Israel ever had. V'yu lo shamar lalecha b'torat Hashem el Yisrael, b'chol levavo, lo sam yachotot yorvam asher chtit Yisrael. V'yimehem echel Hashem liktot b'Yisrael, v'yakem chazel b'chol gvu Yisrael, min yarden b'chulei b'chulei. Now, that's the most difficult point now. Yehu does everything Elisha told him to do. Wipes out the whole house of Achav, gets rid of Baal. What should happen to Israel's situation now? We should recover and go great again. What happens instead? We go down. That's exactly that's what we did. Yehu's revolt leads to a fall on the thing. Boy, we're in trouble, aren't we? From a prophetic point of view, we got rid of all the Nevi'ei Baal, all the Nevi'ei Asherah. We wiped them all out. We did everything God said to do. We got rid of the house of Achav. What should God do now? We should prosper. And what happens instead? Everything falls apart. And there's a good reason everything falls apart. Because everything Achav did is undone. What was Achav's key to success? The treaty with Lebanon. What happened to that? He cut his bridges, didn't he? When you kill Izebel, that's it. Now Lebanon's our enemy. Right? You had an ally, and now they're your enemy. You have to be careful with your allies. He had a treaty with Yehuda, didn't he? Achav and Yehoshaphat worked together, and their kids worked together. They were going to war together all the time. Now what happened? He killed the king of Yehuda. And Athaliah gets really angry, remember, and kills the rest of them. And Athaliah is still in charge down there, and she's the daughter of Achav. And she's running Yehuda. So his ties with Yehuda are ruined. You follow? Now, how about Aram? Well, he was fighting in the Gilad. He just abandoned the whole front line. We were fighting in the Gilad. He took his whole army to do the coup d'etat in Shomron. What happened to the front line? They lost it. The Gilad falls. And Aram takes over. You understand he commits political suicide? And for a very logical reason, everything falls apart. It gets so bad within a decade, Shomron's under siege from Aram, aren't they? That's the story later on. What I want to show you is the stories that happen the stories about Yehu, the stories of Elisha that we have in Prakim Dalet, Hey, Vav, and Zayin, where it just says Melech Yisrael, most likely are happening during the reign of Yehu, or Yehu's children. Because what's the last Elisha story? It's coming up. That's the next. That's your last parak. In Parak Yud Gimel, what's the last Elisha story? In Parak Yud Gimel, pasuk Yud Daled. Elisha chalat choyo asher yamut bo, ve'er elav Yoash melech Yisrael, ve'efka panav yomer avi avi rechav Yisrael parashav. Elisha's career ends under the reign of Yoash. Who's Yoash? The grandson of Yehu. So Yehu is appointed by Elisha. Yehu is king for many years, for decades. His son Achaziel, I think 17 years. And then Yoash. Elisha is Navi during the reigns of Yehu, Yoachaz, and Yoash. Some 40, but I think close to 40 years there. And the last 8 years of Yoram ben Ahab. To say that all the Elisha stories happen only during the last years of Ahab, and nothing happens during the time of Yehu, except for the very end, can't be. It makes a lot more sense that only the Elisha stories are happening during the reign of Yehu and Achaziel and Yoash, especially the siege on Shomron. It doesn't make sense the siege of Shomron takes place during the reign of Ahab, when Ahab he's a superpower. It doesn't fit historically into that time period. Now, what happened instead? Sefer Melachim has a whole Megillah called Megillat Elisha, and during the time period of Elisha, where the king is from the house of Yehu, he's just called Melech Yisrael. A, because Prakim are out of order, so we don't know who Yehu is yet, number one. And number two, the whole point of that unit is everyone needs to know there's a Navi Yisrael. Now, why is that so important? Why do I need all the miracles of Elisha? That's the question I want to answer now. Is why is it that Elisha, of all the Navim, has to do all these miracles? I think the answer, I'm going to say, is simple, but I think it's straightforward. Elisha is behind the revolt, isn't he? Elisha instigated. Everyone knows that God, the Bnei Nevim, are behind the revolt against the house of Ahab. And now it's a people's revolt against the house of Ahab. Because they're unhappy with Ahab, the way he's running the country, or Yoram and Izebel. They're finally angry with him because they're exploiting the people. But what does everyone expect to happen? Once Yehu becomes king, things should get better. And things get worse. When things get worse, who do they blame? The Bnei Nevi'im, who said break your ties with all your allies. Right? There's a group of extremists saying, break the tie, forget your allies to the west, forget Lebanon, forget Izebel and the king of Sidon, and forget your ties with Yehuda. Right? And God will be with you. You follow? Get rid of all Avodat Baal. And what happens instead? A disaster. A famine. Everything's falling apart. Who are they blaming? They blame the Navi. And what's Elisha have to show them? Yesh Navi b'Yisrael. Right? Don't blame the Navi. Remember all the stories that happen? Don't come to me. Don't come to him. He goes to the king. Let me show you there's a king in Israel. And finally, God's able to help them. It'll take a while. But they have a price to pay before they have the recovery. Elisha has to prove to the people there is a Navi, and who's to blame? The people are to blame, not the Navi. And therefore, Elisha has to pretty much prove his credibility, because his credibility is under question. That brings up a bigger question. It has to do with miracles by Navim in general. Why is it that, unlike all the other Navim, Eliyahu and Elisha are miracle workers? To the point that people think that's what Navi are supposed to do. Like the classic Navi, people think, if you ask kids, who's the most popular Navi? After Moshe Rabbeinu, they all nominate Eliyahu. Probably because he comes to the Seder and drinks a cup of wine, but more than that, he's known for his miracles. But other than Eliyahu and Elisha, where do we find Navim who do miracles? The main job of a Navi is to lead the people towards serving God. When do you need a miracle? It has to do with the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and I'll conclude with this. When the existence of God is in question, right, I need a Navi to prove that there is a God. And therefore, when the Jewish people have doubts in their belief of God, that there is a God, or there's one God, you need a miracle as a jump start to show that there is a God. The best example is Yetziat Mitzrayim. Vidatem k'nei Hashem. I need miracles to prove that God exists, and there's one God, and He's the only God and the most powerful God. I need miracles for that. Once I know that God exists, and it's clear that God exists, and He's your God, and the question is how to serve Him, then I need a normal Navi. Then a Navi has to teach Torah. Okay? When Am Yisrael needs a mace, when they need a miracle, that's a sign of weakness. They're signs that are on a low level. When the existence of God is in question, I need a miracle. Once the people know that they're God and they're serving God, but they need to know how to serve God, then I need a teacher. Then I need Yeshayahu, I need Yirmiyahu. I need to know what God wants you to do. That's how to serve God the right way. And what's Avodat Hashem, what's the true way? Remember, that, don't give me your korbanot, I want, all the classic lines from Nevi'im Achronim. Yirmiyahu doesn't need to do miracles. Yeshayahu just have to give words because the people think they're serving God. They're just serving God the wrong way. When Avodat Baal is successful and people think the Baal God is stronger than their God, so I need to do a miracle to show that the Baal God isn't a God at all. When the existence of God is in question, I need a miracle. When it's question how to serve God, that's the regular kind of Navi. And that's why Eliyahu has to deal with the fact that Avodat Baal is too successful, and Elisha has to deal with the problem that we got rid of Avodat Baal, and now things got bad. Do you follow the flip side? When we got rid of Baal, things got bad. So we have to prove it's not because we heard Baal that things are bad. It's not that Baal's angry with us, that God's angry with us, because he proved Yesh Navi. That's why he has to do the miracles. Now, the last thing I want to do, so why does God come and save them? So look in Perek Yud Gimel, that's your last parak, or the end, actually go to Perek Yud Daled. Perek Yud Daled, Pasuk Chav Gimel. What finally leads to the recovery? And what's the reason for it? There's two sources I want to do, which deal with other Nevi'im now. B'shat 15 shana lamatzia ben Yoash, have it, chapter 14, verse 23. B'shat 15 shana lamatzia ben Yoash melech Yehuda, malach Yerovam ben Yoash melech Yisrael b'Shomron 41 shana. He's king for a long time. Vayasar ben Hashem lo sami kol chatot Yerovam ben Nebat asher chtit Yisrael. What king is this? Yoash? I'm sorry, this is Yerovam ben Yoash. He's going to be one of the greatest kings Israel ever had. That's the next high point. We went from Yoshaphat Achav down, and now we're back to Uziel Yerovam ben Yoash. Things finally get better during the time of Yerovam ben Yoash. Why? Pasuk Chavei. Hu eshiv et gvul Yisrael milavo chamat ad yam harava. He brings our borders back to the way they were in the good old times. Why? Ki dvar Hashem Elohei Yisrael asher diber b'yad avdo Yonah ben Amittai hanavi asher migat Chefer. Chazal identify Yonah from Sefer Yonah as this Yonah, because it's the same name, Yonah ben Chefer, and they say he is the Nar that Elisha brought back to life, and he's the Nar who he sent to anoint Yehu. They put them all together because it's the same time period. It works perfectly. But what's he say? Kira Hashem et oni Yisrael morem mo'od v'efes asur v'efes ozu ve'in ozer Yisrael. Right out of Shirat Hazinu. Why does God help them? Midat HaRachamim. He felt sorry for them. V'lo diber Hashem limchot et shem Yisrael mitachat hashamayim v'yoshem b'yad Yerovam ben Yoash. V'yet divram v'chudei. What's the Navi have to explain? Why things are bad even though we apparently did tshuva, it wasn't enough tshuva, and why things go good even though we're not deserving. So it's what the Navi has to do is to explain why our history doesn't correlate with our religious behavior. So here we have a reason why things are getting better, even though how come we go back up again even though we're not so religious? God gives us a chance. Now, what will happen next, that'll be the next big topic. Things get really good again in the time of Yerovam and Yerovam ben Yoash and Uziel. That's the next high point. Aram falls. Ashur hasn't come into power yet. Things are going really good. Nineveh is just starting. Ashur is just starting to become strong. Israel is a superpower now, doing great. And God is hoping that the people will reciprocate and act properly again. And we got rid of idol worship. But what's happening in the time of Uziel, if you read Yeshayahu, the people are so prosperous, it leads to affluence. It leads to haughtiness. And what's God say? If you don't appreciate why I gave you prosperity, if you don't appreciate the blessing I gave you under Yerovam ben Yoash, right? If you keep up that haughtiness and you continue mistreating those who have less than you, what's God going to do? I'm going to bring in Hoya Shor Shevet Api. And that's the background to understand what's going to happen with with Yeshayahu in the time of and the rise of Ashur. At the same time, were the Nevi'im, that's Hosea, Yeshayahu, Amos, and Micha. Okay? When they're warning the Jewish people about their affluence, and you better get your society back together again, otherwise God will bring in Ashur. Yonah, the same Navi who explained why things are getting better, is sent to where? The capital of Ashur. And tells them to do what? To do tshuva. And they listen. The same time period, Hosea, Amos, Yeshayahu go to Am Yisrael and tell them do tshuva. And what happens? They don't listen. Who does God bring in to punish us? Ashur. You see what's going on between where Yonah fits into Jewish history? When you understand the time period? That's why it's so important to realize where Yonah fits in. And then that's going to bring that's going to lead to the fall. And then the Nevi'im have to explain why do things go bad, even though we're still serving God. Then the whole reason is because they're not doing chesed, like we read in Yirmiyahu, those who did the Haftarah from Yirmiyahu today. One last line from Nevi'im in Hosea. Look in the beginning of Hosea. Okay. Was the bloodbath worth it? Hosea, the beginning of Trei Asar. The bloodbath that Yehu did, was it the right thing or the wrong thing? He killed a lot of people, all in the name of God. But it wasn't very successful, was it? It could have been. Yeah. But what happened? So Hosea begins as follows. Hosea is going to, again, predict the fall of Israel from this big time period. Because Hosea talking in the time of Uzziyahu, Yotam, and Achaz, and Yerovam ben Yoash. Hosea is exactly at the high point here, the second high point that we just got to. What's he saying? The whole story. And what's he tell him? Pasuk Daled. V'yomer Hashem elav crush mo Yezre'el ki od ma'at upakadati dmei Yisrael abeit Yehu v'ishbati malchut beit Yisrael. What is the house of Israel? What's the house of Yehu? The last king, the descendant from the house of Yehu, is Yerovam ben Yoash, the great-grandson of Yehu. What did Yehu do? He killed thousands of people in the name of Israel. For what reason? All in the name of God. And he was commissioned by God, by the Navi, to do it. Now, had he done properly, had he followed God the right way, and set up a better kingdom up north, had they returned to Avodat Hashem the proper way, had they reunited with Yerushalayim the proper way, then things could have gone well. But what do we find 30, 40, 50 years later? God helps them out and they become prosperous again. But again, they go astray. And they don't build the society God wants. What's God say in hindsight? I'm going to punish you for all the blood you killed in Israel. For what? It was just another coup d'etat. So another person took over. If God gave you the ability to take over the government, you were expected to do something with it. If the only thing happened is a new government, but the people's behavior is no better, then what do we gain? And in prophetic hindsight, Hosea is saying, the house of Yehu is going to be punished for all the blood that was killed in Israel. And that's, Hosea is very sharp. Beit Yehu is going to be punished for what they did wrong. They meant well in the beginning, but in hindsight, because you didn't do anything better, the same thing is going to happen later in the end of Sefer Melachim, when Israel is going to be thrown out of the land, in the time of Menachem, in Perach Chaf Aleph, God's going to say, you're worse than the Amorites. You kicked out the Amorites for their bad behavior. You're acting just as bad. I'll have to throw you out. Sometimes God gives us the right to be successful, to defeat enemies, with the hope that we're going to do better. But if God does miracles for us, or helps us out economically or militarily against our enemies, but we don't fix things up the way we should, then we can be held responsible for that killing. Because when God gives us the ability to be successful and we take that victory and act properly as God's people, then it becomes okay. If we just take it for our own gain, but not to serve God the proper way, then de facto that becomes like murder. And that's what Hosea is talking about. Anyway, so this, I told you, it's a very complicated time period. I try to give you a little explanation to understand what's happening during this. Basically, we went from Yoshaphat Achav to Uzziyahu Yerovam. We explained what caused the fall, what causes the rise, why there's all these miracles with Elisha and Eliyahu in the meantime, the big questions that come up, and those are the questions the Nevi'im at the time have to deal with. When we appear to be doing good religiously, why do things go bad? Because even though it might be externally okay, our society is still bad. And why sometimes things go good even though we're bad? Because God gives us another opportunity. But if we don't take that opportunity and reciprocate, we can be responsible for it later on. So that's our hope. It's probably still a little complicated, but hopefully it gives a little oversight, an overview of what's going on. It's the most unstudied time period, I think, in Jewish history. Right? And that's why probably the names are flying over the place. But since you guys are learning Perek Yomi, I want to put a little structure to it so you know what's happening in the bigger picture of the events. Okay, Shabbat Tov. And Chag Sameach.